Tēnā koutou te whānau o Auckland Unitarians. Tēnā koutou nā manuhiri, no mai, haere mai ki tēnei whare karakia a te atua. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. We have gathered in this space made sacred over the last 115 years by Auckland Unitarians to honor and understand our lives. We bring our pasts and would share them, our dreams and would express them. We use words, songs, silence, and gesture. Words cannot define our lives, but they enable us to reach out to each other, to tell and to listen, that we may be renewed, connected, and unburdened. Apprehend with wonder the lives of those around you, for from wonder into wonder, existence opens. We wish to welcome you if you're a guest or a visitor, just passing through or looking for a spiritual home. Your decision to spend this morning with us not only honors us, but strengthens us as a community. Please join us for morning tea. It is our sacrament of hospitality, and it won't be complete without you. As any of you who follow me on Facebook know, my partner is a phenomenal dancer at a flash mob, where at a rally yesterday, all of members from all the political parties, most of them, 5 of the political parties, spoke to how they were going to bring gender equality pay to New Zealand after many, many years of saying we were going to do it. It's clear that the issue of gender equality is a battle that seems never ending. And so my opening words are from Margaret Fuller, who wrote them in the 1830s. You'll learn more about Margaret in my talk. We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down. We would have every path laid open to woman as freely as to man. Were this done and a slight temporary fermentation allowed to subside, we should see crystallizations more pure, of more various beauty. We believe the divine energy would pervade nature to a degree unknown in the history of former ages, and that no discordant collision, but a ravishing harmony of the spheres would ensue. Yet then, and only then, will mankind be ripe for this, when inward and outward freedom for woman, as much as for man, shall be acknowledged as a right, not yielded as a concession. We light this chalice to celebrate the inherent worth and dignity of every person, to reaffirm the historic pledge of liberal religion to seek that justice which transcends mere legality and moves towards the resolution of true equality, and to share that love which is ultimately beyond even our cherished reason, that love which unites us. As anyone knows as anyone in my line of work knows, there is a vast body of religious humor. Every faith and denomination has theirs. Generally, they're not nasty. They're the kind of jokes we tell on ourselves, self-deprecating humor that reveals something about who we are, including our foibles. As a Unitarian, I have a rich body of humor to draw upon. For a small denomination, we laugh at ourselves a lot. One that tickles me goes like this. A group of children in a religious ed class were trying to determine the sex of a rabbit. There's only one way to decide, said one child. Let's take a vote. I was only going to share one, but then I remembered this one. A visitor to a Unitarian Universalist church sat through the sermon with growing incredulity at the heretical ideas being spouted. After the sermon, a member asked the visitors, "So, how did you like it?" "I can't believe half the things that minister said," sputtered the visitor in outrage. "Oh, good. You'll fit right in." For those who have been Unitarians a while, a lot of these are old jokes. But recently, I thought I heard a new one. It was a recent headline in the papers. Unitarian Universalists elect first woman president. What's the punchline, I wondered? How could the most progressive of liberal religious traditions just now get around to breaking the glass ceiling for the top job? Remember, the Universalists were amongst the first to ordain a woman in 1863. The Unitarians followed suit in 1871. I don't know the answer, but I think historians will tell us years from now that this election marked an important transition in the direction of our religious tradition. Why do I think so? Because Unitarian and Universalist women have been shaping who we are for some time. There are so many women who have played a role in who we are, it is difficult to choose. But it has to begin with Mary Wollstonecraft. According to the Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biography, Mary was a revolutionary advocate of equal rights for women, an inspiration for both the 19th century and 20th century women's movements. Wollstonecraft was not merely a woman's rights advocate. She asserted the innate rights of all people whom she thought victims of a society that assigned people their roles, comforts, and satisfactions according to the false distinctions of class, age, and gender. Born in England in 1757, she endured a difficult upbringing, denied the opportunities bestowed on her brother for education. It was Mary's genius that allowed her to rise above these handicaps and transform her experience into a dream of a reordered society. From 1782 until 1785, Mary was a congregant at the Unitarian Chapel at Newington Green, during which time she was influenced by its minister, Richard Price. Through her friendship with Dr. Price, she entered a circle, an amazing circle of intellectuals and radicals, including Joseph Priestley, Thomas Paine, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Blake, and William Godwin. In response to criticism of Price and Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, Mary immediately wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Men. This work was overshadowed by another response to Burke, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, which followed several months later. In Rights of Men, Wollstonecraft presented her vision of a society based on equality of opportunity, in which talent, not the wrongful privileges of gentility, would be the requisite for success. Paine and Wollstonecraft were accused in the press of seeking to, quote, poison and inflame the minds of the lower class of His Majesty's subjects to violate their subordination. When Paine was later burnt in effigy for his support of revolutionary France, there was public talk of subjecting Mary to the same treatment. Wollstonecraft decided to devote her next treatise to women's rights, a topic that had never before been dealt with at any length. The resulting vindication of the rights of women in 1792, was in part her response to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in Emile in 1762 had recommended that girls be given a different education from boys, one that would train them to be submissive and manipulative. In Rights of Woman, Mary argued that the rights of man, which she had previously espoused, applied equally and unconditionally to a woman, as a just God could not have created one human being superior to another. She sought to overturn centuries of Judeo-Christian teaching that women, having no separate moral identity, depended upon their husbands for a spiritual relationship with God. Mary boldly declared that all people, men, women, and children, have a right to an independent mind. She envisioned a society in which women could be educated and work alongside men as co-equals in every pursuit. She advocated equal citizenship for both sexes, giving everyone, quote, a direct share in deliberations of government, unquote. Pretty radical idea in that time. Mary opposed war and all forms of oppression. Let there be no coercion established in society, she said. And the common law of gravity prevailing, the sexes shall fall into proper places. An advocate of universal self-reliance and responsibility, she did not wish that women should exercise power over men, only over themselves. The historian Henry Noel Brailsford considered The Rights of Woman perhaps the most original book of its century. What was absolutely new in world's history, he thought, was that for the first time a woman dared to sit down to write a book which was not an echo of men's thinking, nor an attempt to do rather well what some men had done a little better, but a first exploration of the problems of society and morals from a standpoint which recognized humanity without ignoring sex. Mary embraced a religion that combined faith with reason, morality with knowledge, and which placed no limits on human inquiry. I submit to the moral laws which my reason deduces, she said. It is not an arbitrary will, but to unerring reason. She rejected the notion that the faculty of reason is exclusively a male attribute. Who made man the exclusive judge, she asked. She sensed the presence of God in nature and recorded a mystical experience in which her soul rested on itself and seemed to fill the universe. I've devoted so much time of this sermon to Mary because she brought both mind and heart to Unitarianism and was the first to preach a feminist gospel. Unitarian and Universalist women have continued to preach it until the present day. The next woman to pick up Mary's mantle was Margaret Fuller. According to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Margaret possessed more influence on the thought of American women than any woman previous to her time, unquote. Author, editor, and teacher, Fuller contributed significantly to the American Renaissance in literature and to mid-19th century reform movements. A brilliant and highly educated member of the Transcendentalist group, she challenged even Waldo Emerson, both intellectually and emotionally. Women who attended her conversations, and many prominent men of her time, found Fuller's influence life-changing. Her major work, Woman in the 19th Century, published in 1845, profoundly affected the women's rights movement, which had its formal beginning at Seneca Falls, New York, 3 years later. Her book was her major gift to the times, a manifesto for the women's rights movement. It revealed Fuller's enormous knowledge of literature and philosophy as she described the oppression of the female sex through history and advocated equal status for women. Years later, Horace Greeley, then editor of the Herald Tribune, wrote, "If not the clearest and most logical, it was the loftiest and most commanding assertion yet made of the right of woman to be regarded and treated as an independent, intelligent, rational being, entitled to an equal voice in framing and modifying the laws she is required to obey, and in controlling and disposing of the property she has inherited or aided to acquire. Hers is the ablest, bravest, broadest assertion yet made of what are termed woman's rights." Fuller's feminist gospel continued the work of Mary Wollstonecraft in shaping Unitarianism, for she brought heart to her rational religion. While part of the transcendentalist scene, Fuller wrote her personal credo. She wished to be a Christian in full possession of my reasoning powers. She believed in Christ because I can do without him, but I do not wish to do without him. He is constantly aiding and answering me. But Christ was not enough. She wrote in 1842, "We have all had the Messiah to reconcile and teach. Let us have another to live out all the symbolical forms of human life with the calm beauty and physical fullness of a Greek god, with the deep consciousness of a Moses, with the holy love and purity of Jesus." She did not reject the church, as did some transcendentalists, but she joined them in finding that nowhere I worship less than in places set apart for that purpose. The blue sky seen above the opposite roof preaches better than any brother. By the mid-19th century, thanks to such women as Wollstonecraft and Fuller, reform was in the air. It was a time when many Unitarian and Universalist women, not the least of whom were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and in this congregation, our first woman chair of the management committee, Harriet Morrison, a leader in our country's fight for women's suffrage, walking side by side with Kate Shepherd, began to put their feminist gospel into practice. There are so many to choose from to give flesh and blood to a feminist gospel. But the story of Olympia Brown, the first woman ordained to the Universalist ministry, captures the courage and fortitude of these women. Her story is recounted in New Your World. On a crisp autumn morning in 1861, Ebenezer Fisher, too bad we don't use Ebenezer more, don't you think? Ebenezer Fisher, president of the Theological School of St. Lawrence University, heard an authoritative knock at the door. On opening it, he was surprised to see a diminutive young woman holding a suitcase. What he could not know was that this small, softly spoken woman would become one of the most formidable forces in the American women's suffrage movement. Brown would dedicate herself to assuring that women could take their rightful place in the ministry and in every facet of American life. The encounter with Fisher tells us a lot about Brown. Every other theological school she applied to rejected her. Only Fisher offered her admission, adding this caveat: "I do not think women are called to the ministry, but I leave that between you and the great head of the church." And that is exactly where Brown thought it should be left. She left her home state of Michigan for Canton, New York, announcing to Fisher on her arrival that she would be enrolling at the Universalist Divinity School. The president was confused. He thought he had written her a pointedly discouraging letter. Well, she told him, according to her autobiography, "Your discouragement was my encouragement." One of Brown's first challenges at Divinity School was her high, thin voice. For amusement, her classmates, all men of course, would gather under her window and recite her sermons in high falsetto voices. In class, a seminarian denigrated these sermons as being passably written, but asserted that they could hardly be called sermons. But the ridicule simply spurred her on. Brown not only graduated from Divinity School, she convinced the Northern Universalist Association to ordain her at its meeting in Malone, New York on June 25th, 1863. As for her voice, in 1864, Brown enrolled at the Dio Lewis School of Speech, where the school's founder developed a series of exercises to help her build her lung capacity. Brown did the exercises throughout her life and became a powerful public speaker. Neighbors in Racine, Wisconsin, where she was minister of what is now the Olympia Brown UU Church, often heard her in her garden reciting her sermons and speeches to the flowers. While Brown was still in her first ministry in Weymouth Landing, Massachusetts, a meeting with Susan B. Anthony persuaded her to work for women's suffrage. A skilled organizer for many years, she balanced her home life with her duties as a minister and suffragist. She raised a son and a daughter and had a loving and felicitous marriage to Henry Willis. At 52, she left full-time parish ministry to work for getting women the vote. After the 19th Amendment passed in 1919, she was one of the few early pioneers who was still alive to cast her vote. The last years of her life were devoted to working for world peace, and she became a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Considering this story, it is surprising that following the passage of the 19th Amendment Brown worked so hard to pass, there was a drastic decline in the number of Unitarian and Universalist women being ordained. The General Superintendent of the Universalist Church wrote in 1935 of a tremendous prejudice against women ministers. At the present time, I find it is practically impossible to get any woman minister a hearing at any salary whatever. Excuse me. This was reflected not only in the U.S. but in Britain. New Zealand was the exception. In 1929, our congregation called Wilna Constable the first ordained woman of any denomination to serve a New Zealand church. Amongst her achievements, which were numerous, was championing a bill in Parliament to allow women ministers to officiate at weddings. However, in the U.S. by 1950, there were no Unitarian women settled as ministers. And the Universalists had only 3. By 1968, only 2% of Unitarian and Universalist ministers were women. In the mid-1970s, the ordaining of women exploded, in part because of second-wave feminism. While first-wave feminism had focused on suffrage, inequality, and property rights, second-wave feminism broadened the debate to a wide range of issues: sexuality, family, the workplace, reproductive rights, and legal inequalities. In the UUA, the second wave forced clergy to examine personal patriarchal attitudes and systemic patriarchy in the denomination. Today, over 60% of UU ministers are women. This in part explains why it took so long for a woman to be elected president. The other part is that a generation gap had to be left. Unitarians of the 50s and 60s were escaping churches. They defiantly testified about the doctrines they no longer believed in. This older generation tends to shun rites, symbols, and most religious language. Today, they are the conservatives who fidget with sweaty palms as a new generation of clergy, who are predominantly women, come into leadership, eager to explore new spiritual frontiers. Like Mary Wollstonecraft and Margaret Fuller, they remind men and women to bring heart into rational religion. They are eager to experience the presence of God, the goddess, or some other god to be named later. God language doesn't particularly trouble them. Time will tell how these Unitarian Universalist women will shape our living tradition. But with a woman now at the top, they will continue the long tradition of preaching a feminist gospel, which has enriched us for over 200 years. And that's no joke. For our meditation, I want to share a story by Robert Walsh. In the newspaper, there was a story about a seminary professor in Kansas City who was put on trial by the Southern Baptists, accused of being a Universalist. It's no wonder they were suspicious. He had stated publicly his belief that all people born into the world are children of God, and if that were not enough, he also supported the ordination of women. Case closed. The professor denied the charges. "I'm not a Universalist," he said, and he convinced them. After 4 hours of deliberation, they voted 21-11 to let him keep his job. Walsh writes, "Now I confess to being a Universalist. In fact, I'm a Unitarian Universalist. But I wonder, if I were arrested and charged with being one, would there be enough evidence to convict me?" The Kansas City story proves that having the right beliefs is not enough. The professor believed that all people are brothers and sisters, that every person has a piece of the divine spark, that women are the equals of men in the sight of God. That was not enough to bring in a guilty verdict. No, if they're going to pin Unitarian Universalism on me, they will have to be able to show that I participated in and supported a Unitarian Universalist church. That's the only way to be sure. Beliefs, no matter how noble, must be embodied in a living institution, or they will have no convicting power. For your meditation, would you be convicted? For my closing words, blessed are we who gather with open hearts together in this space today. Blessed are we, the chalice lighters of resistance, justice, love, and faith. Blessed are we, the heretics, the outcasts, the walkers of our own way. Blessed are we, the border crossers, the refugees, the immigrants, the poor, the wanderers who are not lost. Blessed are we, the transgressors, the trespassers, the passers-by, the cause takers, the defiant, the compliant. Blessed are we, the hand extenders, the sign makers, the protesters, the protectors. Blessed are we, the trans women, the trans men, the non-binary, the cisgender, the multigender, the no gender. Blessed are we, the friend, the stranger, the lonely, the hidden, the visible, the authentic. Blessed are we who rise in solidarity. Blessed are we who cannot. Blessed are we who do not. Blessed are we, for this is our beloved community, and this is who we are.